When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
When you check out at the pharmacy, you see the journey from idea to medicine, thanks to our intellectual property system, or IP for short. IP safeguards inventions, like a new way to prevent seizures or lower cholesterol. And IP supports competition from other brands, then lower cost generics, which are 90% of prescriptions filled in the US. Innovation, competition, lower costs, thanks to IP. Learn more at phrma.org/IP Works Wonders.
Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcasts, and Killer Podcasts presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed. I'm your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcast, and Killer Podcast production. So, we've had an interesting week in the world of assassinations, actually. CEO Brian Thompson of United Healthcare was gunned down in Midtown Manhattan on Wednesday, December 4th, by an unknown assailant. And yes, it looks like in the video that this man was probably an amateur, but it also looks like he might have had a motive, and it was definitely a pre-planned attack because he waited outside of the hotel that Mr. Thompson was residing in. Now, this is something that is obviously very movie-like, but we all know Occam's razor is usually what happens in these situations, and United Healthcare is apparently one of the largest insurance companies that denies the most amount of claims. So there are probably some people out there who are disgruntled and have a bone to pick with this individual in this company. And apparently there was some writing on the casings, the deny, defend, depose, and you can read into that however you will. They have released some pictures of this individual, and he appears to be a young white male, and the gun he used, I'm not quite sure what type of gun it was, maybe a zip gun, as Jesse Pollock said on social media, but either way, it's one of those cases that definitely stands out because we've all been groomed by movies and all the scenarios of conspiracy theories and all the things that we basically have come to know as entertainment. But yesterday, or on the 4th of December, it was a reality check, and this person had a family, and being murdered is absolutely horrendous. And regardless of what the motive was, nobody deserves to be gunned down on the street like a dog. It's just it's terrible, and a dog shouldn't be put down either. So it's interesting to see the discourse on social media with a lot of people out there cheering on this type of action, and it's kind of disgusting. I think it's easy for people to get interested in this particular case because there's one, video evidence, and two, the term assassination is being used. So those two things alone will drive interest in a story like this. And we will only wait and see. As I record this right now, the individual has not been apprehended. Again, I mentioned they did release pictures, and they have put out a $10,000 reward for any information. And not to laugh, but that is a pretty shallow reward. So anyway, that is kind of the biggest news of the world of true crime right now. I think with Delphi sentencing coming up, I think that will be good to finally close that chapter, and we can move on to other things. And one of those other things is concluding the story that I had been telling you about a distant relative of mine named one Dr. Frank E. Thurber. Now, this story came to me through a conversation I had with my mom, and she told me that I had a distant relative who was murdered in northern Michigan, which is also where we vacation. So it was very weird to learn of this incident. Now, granted, it happened way back in the day in 1889, and the news broke on August 11th when a telegram arrived at all the major newspapers in the state of Michigan, and it read, 2 men murdered. Now, the writer whose work is the primary source for this episode is Larry Wakefield. Now, he's the author of Murder at the Sawmill. He has long been interested in the history of Grand Traverse region, and I think I mentioned last week that I actually owned a book of his, The Missing Nun, that I didn't even realize I had owned, but I saw it and I was like, oh, wait, that's in my library. That's crazy. So this man, Larry Wakefield, he basically wrote a lot of books about the northern Michigan area. And in 1979, he did a 4-part series on the murder of undersheriff Neil Marshall and Dr. Frankie Thurber. So the story goes that the undersheriff and Dr. Thurber went to collect some outstanding tax payments from one Mr. Wright, who owned the sawmill. And again, this was a very new thing in the late 1800s, and it has not settled in very well with Mr. Wright, who does not want to pay his taxes. And he basically, was stubborn and said, I'm not paying. And they finally put out a warrant for his payments. And I'm going to read directly from the 3rd part of Mr. Wakefield's 4-part series on the murder of Neil Marshall and Dr. Frankie Thurber. Quote, when it became clear to Marshall that Wright's workers would stand behind their boss, Marshall backed off and left to seek reinforcements. Marshall recruited Dr. Frank Thurber, one of the country's most popular and well-respected men. Together they returned to the mill and were immediately confronted by Wright, who had been drinking heavily all day. A heated argument ensued, and Marshall attempted to grab Wright's rifle. Wright shot him, and after that, Thurber struggled with Wright. Wright pulled a pistol from his hip pocket and then shot Thurber in the head. Wright paid off his men and took to the woods. Meanwhile, news of the killing spread like wildfire throughout the county, and the sheriff, who was in Benzonia, raised a posse and raced to the scene. A large, angry crowd gathered at the mill that evening, and there was talk of a lynching. A young Ottawa Indian, Peter Lahala, who seemed to someone in the crowd to be acting suspiciously, was seized and dragged to a pine tree nearby. The crowd secured a rope to a barge, and someone in the crowd knew how to tie a hangman's knot. The noose was placed around Lahala's neck, and the other of the rope was thrown over a convenient branch. The Indian was told that unless he revealed Wright's hiding place, he would die. Lahala protested that he knew nothing and was hoisted off his feet, Sheriff Case having told him to shake his legs vigorously if he wanted to talk. Lahala was hoisted off the ground and lowered at least 3 times. On being hanged for the 3rd time, he said hoarsely that he would speak. He told them Wright was waiting at a sandhill near the beach, about a mile north of Errol. He also said Wright had arranged with him to meet them there with a boat after the barge was loaded, and take Wright out to the Seymour. He said that he and Pamagishke were frightened to do it. And this is another interesting thing because he referenced here that this was the delightful teller of tales, Herman Bain noted in his memoirs, that he felt sorry for the poor Indian who had to go through it with a crooked neck. The Benzie reporter, on the other hand, called Lahala a wretch. Interesting times. Back to the story. After the hanging and confession of Lahala, a game warden who lived in a rival lumber town a few miles south was patrolling the beach north of Errol with a companion. Krause told the story at the hearing as follows. Quote, "We heard a crackling of twigs as we were old hunters. We stopped and listened. Ernest said he could see a man with a light summer hat dodging from tree to tree. I saw him too, and with my Winchester calling, 'Come out of there.' I heard the man answer and couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the voice. I said, 'Is that you, Charlie?' And he said, 'Yes, Ed. For God's sake, don't let them shoot me.' I constantly covered him, saying, 'Do you want to surrender?' He said, 'Yes, but I ask for your protection. Don't let them kill me.' I said, 'Charlie, hold up your hands, no foul play. Step out and show up. Are you armed?' 'No,' Charlie said, and he came towards me with his hands up. 'Ed, where's Sheriff Case? Can you protect me?' said Charlie. Krause hallowed for the sheriff, and part of the mob came running up, yelling for blood. Among them was Marshall, brother of the slain deputy, carrying a rifle. 'Are you the man that killed my brother?' he said. 'No, sir, I ain't,' said Wright nervously. 'You ain't, eh?' Marshall said. He pointed the rifle at Wright's head. Krause jumped between the two and disarmed Marshall. 'Cool down and let me take this to our course. This is my prisoner, and I will protect him.' Other deputies formed a circle around Wright and kept the crowd away while they handcuffed the prisoner and searched him. They found a .44 caliber bulldog revolver in his pocket. Wright was taken to his house and given an hour to handle his business affairs. That afternoon, his wife returned from visiting relatives in Racine. After several weeks on the stagecoach from Frankfurt, she had seen the bodies on the road and told what had happened, but she had not seen her husband until the sheriff brought him in. One could imagine the meeting was a gloomy affair. Wright left the mill operation in the hands of their wife and brother-in-law, Fred Crossett. Then he was taken aboard Dewar, and, along with the sheriff and his men, arrived at Frankfurt at sunrise and was locked up in the Frankfurt jail. Also aboard was Neil Marshall's body. The Frankfurt jail was a rather flimsy affair, and all day on Sunday, there were threats of violence, and toward evening, a small mob skirmished around the building. They scattered after someone fired a shot. With all the rumblings at the Frankfurt jail, the sheriff decided that he would move Charles Wright to the Manistee jail. Now, this was something that was in protection of not only the officers in charge, but the defendant himself. I mean, there were people that were mad that he killed these two individuals. There were people that were mad that he was arrested. So it was definitely a tense situation, and I can understand why the sheriff would make the decision to take him to Manistee. Dr. Thurber's body was taken to South Holland, Michigan, and buried there near his boyhood home. Neil Marshall's funeral took place Monday in Benzonia. Now, that was the Monday following the murder, and it was attended, as it was said, by the most significant number of people ever to gather in Benzie. He was buried on Cemetery Hill overlooking the town. The inscription on his headstone read and reads, "Faithful unto death, and while performing his duty, fell by the murderer's hand." A hearing was held in Benzonia before Justice W.L. Case. A suitable county building needs to be built for the purpose. Wright's brother from Wisconsin, his wife and her brother, and his two lawyers were admitted to the courtroom before the general public. Mrs. Wright went to her husband and clasped his manacled hands. Mrs. Marshall and her daughters, aged 5 to 12, entered the company of her mother, brother, and brother-in-law. Quote, a reporter of the Grand Rapids Press describes her as, quote, rather a rather frail lady, appears to be very intelligent, and although she does not take to be 30 or 35, her hair is quite gray. Her brother was Louis Sands, a lumber mogul from Manistee. As he approached the bench where Wright was sitting, he turned and said to Marshall, quote, "This is the man who killed your husband." Then turning to Wright, quote, "Look at this woman whose husband you killed and these children whom you've orphaned." The 4 little girls clung to their mother, crying, and she said with tears running down her face, "Why did you kill my husband?" Altogether, it must have been an emotional scene. And that was Larry Wakefield's third part of his 4-part series. And with that note, we are going to take a break. And we are back. In the first 3 installments, mill owner C.T. Wright killed 2 Benzie County Sheriff's deputies in a dispute over unpaid taxes. On a hot August day in 1889, the deputies had tried to attach Wright's logs, which ensued a scuffle, and Wright killed both and then fled into the woods near the tiny town of Errol. A large and angry crowd gathered at the mill, talking about lynching Wright. An Indian, whom some thought looked suspicious, was grabbed and strung by his neck in a nearby tree to torture Wright's hiding place from the man. Again, this is the La Hala Indian, and after being off his feet at least 3 times, he did tell the posse where Wright was. Again, Wright was captured, and he basically spent months in jail in Traverse City. So Wright's trial opened in the second week of April 1890 after an exhausting 10 days of selecting a jury. Wright's lawyers had used up all of the preemptory challenges. Some 270 individuals were examined before the 12 jurors were selected. Some prospective jurors actually hid in the woods, and Sheriff Case had to go out and round them up. Now, the long drawn-out process of jury selection was not without its moments of humor. Upon being asked about his knowledge of John Macmillan of North Ireland birth, he replied he believed that half the lies he heard were not true. Now, a cross-eyed man was excused because he made the defense and prosecution's lawyers nervous. A sleepy man known to nod off at church was also excused from the jury. Now, during one of the longest recesses, the officials began a baseball game on the college grounds, and the jurors were standing around watching from a raised bandstand. The game was interrupted by the arrival of a half-dozen fresh candidates for jury duty. The Wright murder trial began on April 17th and lasted 2 weeks. They called a dozen witnesses who had witnessed the killings or had heard Wright threaten to kill the 2. The most damaging to Wright was the testimony of Charlie Anderson and Pamagishkik. The defense called 2 men who claimed to have seen Marshall reach behind as if to draw a pistol, but their testimony was primarily discredited upon cross-examination. Pamagishkik's testimony was interpreted by his Indian friend John Jacobs, while the defense had retained Joseph Blackbird to check on the Jacobs' interpretation. Joseph Blackbird was the son of Andrew J. Blackbird, who in 1887 published a history of the Ottawa Chippewa Indians, including a grammar and glossary of the language. In relief from their arduous duties, the jury, after breakfast on April, they went fishing at Crystal Lake and returned an hour later with half-dozen suckers knocked out of the water with poles. They said they caught 17 in all. After being charged by the judge on May 1st, the jury deliberated 2.5 hours and before reaching a verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Wright showed no emotion. Their wife went into hysterics, and he was similarly prostrated. Judge Aldrich sentenced Wright to imprisonment for life at hard labor. On the following day, Sheriff Case and his prisoner departed for the state penitentiary at Jackson. They stopped for dinner at Cadillac, and the weekly newspaper there reported the hotel's festive board was joined congenial and conglomerate group, including Sheriff Case and his prisoner, the millionaire lumberman C.T. Wright, a former female candidate of the presidency, a revered minister, and several plebeian innkeepers. Sheriff Case bid his prisoner goodbye at the prison gates, and Wright told him to drop in whenever he was in the neighborhood. He was almost sure to be at home. Apparently, Case did this several times. Wright was employed in the prison shirt-making shop and later as a bookkeeper for the department. He became a great favorite of the warden, who let Wright drive a horse and buggy and go on rides together. 12 years later, despite the bitter protests of the widows and the former prosecutor George Covell, Wright was set free by Michigan Governor Pingree. For reasons best known to himself, the governor commuted Wright's sentence to 17 years, and with time off for good behavior, he was paroled in May of 1902. Wright paid a brief visit to Benzonia and Errol. His wife divorced him and married a carpenter. One story has it that she came to Wright to be taken back, but that he had turned her down. In another version, Wright visited his former wife and new husband, and she asked him to sing some of her favorite songs, and Wright, who has a beautiful baritone voice, obliges. The lady was so overcome that she dissolved in tears. The carpenter, likewise affected, gave her back to Wright with his blessing, and they lived happily ever after. That's our old friend Herman Bain's story. If it isn't true, it ought to be. In any case, with or without his wife, Wright returned to Racine and was never seen or heard from again in Benzie County. Now, the frail widow Marshall, J. Harrietta was her given name, outlived her husband by 28 years, dying in 1917 at the age of 72. Her oldest daughter lost her mind soon after her father's death and was committed to the state hospital in Traverse City, where she eventually died. And just a little side note, I have been to that state hospital in Traverse City, and as far as state hospitals go, it is probably one of the least scary places in that realm, because you have a view of the beautiful Traverse Bay, and the doctor who was in charge of inventing or building that hospital, he made it sure that everybody had their own room and they had a view. So it was an advanced hospital for its era. Let's just say that. No state hospital is where you want to go, but the one in Traverse City, it's not in use anymore. It's actually been turned into shops and condos, believe it or not. Actually, that shouldn't surprise anybody. But, the state hospital is pretty darn cool. If you get the opportunity, I would Google it. It's one of Michigan's special pieces of architecture, and it's very, very huge. So check that out when you get a chance. So Errol was a small town, and it was created by the sawmill. And when the sawmill went away, the city died. The timber had started to run out, and the Israelites, quote unquote, gave up around 1910 after they had taken over the mill in 1903, and they moved to Benton Harbor. The town lost its post office in 1905, and then people died or moved away. Now, some buildings were burned or were dismantled, and by 1918, it had ceased to exist. Now all that remains to show that men and women once lived and worked there are a few spiles of the old dock, the giant concrete block that was the foundation of the mill steam engine, and the quote-unquote hanging tree. So that was the four-part series, the conclusion of the four-part series by one Larry Wakefield. So I have some articles from the time when Charles T. Wright was actually on trial. And this article from the Grand Rapids Press states, the case of the people against Charles T. Wright for the murder of Frank E. Thurber at Errol in August of last year was called by the Benzie County Circuit Court Judge Aldrich. Now, again, we've talked about the trial. We didn't talk too much about what actually happened within the case. So let's talk a little bit about that real quick. So the prosecution was represented by George Covell, prosecuting attorney assisted by E.S. Pratt of Traverse City and Thomas Smurthwaite of Manistee. The attorneys for the defense were Representative and ex-mayor F.W. Cook of Muskegon and Parker of Frankfort. The jail at Benzonia, a structure a mile out of town near a stand of woods, is deemed unsuitable for the confinement of Wright. Another prisoner charged with horse theft is incarcerated in a room next to Case's Hall, where the trial is held. Both occupy one bed, and the officers reported that a dispute arose among them last night over the division of the bedclothes, which was discomforting to all concerned. The work today was confined to efforts to get a jury. 40 men were called and questioned, and all of them were found to be disqualified. The questions put to the prisoner's counsel were usually along the lines of, quote, "Do you know the respondent? Did you know Frankie Thurber? Have you heard about he was killed by Mr. Wright? Have you ever talked with anybody about this case? Have you ever talked with Wilson Reed about this case?" Reed was the blacksmith employed by Wright at the time of the homicides. It is supposed that he witnessed the occurrence and has frequently recounted his observations. The questioning then continued in the manner, "Do you believe Thurber is dead?" If the reply were in the affirmative, the next question would be, then it would be take some evidence on the part of the respondent to remove that belief. If the answer were yes, the juror would be challenged for having formed an opinion. The issue would be joined on this point and pending the decision by Judge Aldrich to be announced the following day. The juror would step aside. Now, there were 25 men thus disposed of, and the remaining men were challenged for cause. The jury list of the county was composed of 500 men, and it is now clear that it will be challenging for a jury, but this prosecution hopes to succeed before the week's close. Okay, so that was the setup of the trial before it got underway. Now, here's a contemporary article from, I think, 1902. So this is regarding the commuted sentence. So Governor Pingree on Monday commuted the sentence of Charles T. Wright, the wealthy lumberman who was sentenced to imprisonment 10 years ago for the murder of Frankie Thurber and Undersheriff Neil Marshall. Now, Wright's imprisonment is commuted to 17 years and immediate parole is granted. His term will expire May 1st. Next, there is a warrant out for the rearrest of Wright for the killing of Neil Marshall as soon as he is out of prison. So he'll be given until next May to prepare for his trial on that score. The case is one of the most remarkable that has come before the governor, and he has been urged to get its attention for years. The governor's reason for acting in the case is that he does not believe Wright got a fair trial and believes the story told by the prisoner concerning the killing. According to his statement sent to Uncle Ben Colvin and by him to the governor, Wright says that he was, for several years previous to August 10th, 1889, conducting lumber business at Errol or Otter Creek, Benzie County, with a general office and yard in Racine, Wisconsin. He had leased the mill site, erected the necessary buildings, and made other improvements essential to carrying on with the business. The agreement that the leaser was to take the company's improvements and pay for them at the end of the lease it was just one of those options that they give people. So he says, quote, "I found a great many of inhabitants there to be a hard set, commonly referred to as land pirates, and they commenced to harass me shortly after establishing there in many ways by over-assessing me in proportion. Cutting booms, 80, that material would go to waste in Lake Michigan, felling trees into logging roads and blocking them up, and in other malicious ways. But I succeeded in getting along without any serious friction until 1889, the 5th year when this trouble occurred." He then says that he had furnished the township board with labor and materials for $700 in 1888. The town board agreed to give the company warrants for payment of the amount as soon as the taxes were collected. And this they did in January 1889, all but $200. However, when the new county officials came in for the next year, they refused to pay the $200. When the company's taxes came due, Wright gave the township treasurer a draft payable to him personally on his Racine office. And when the money had been paid, he notified his office to garnish the bank to collect the $200. The supervisor then commenced the suit for the whole $700. Still, Wright claims he was the agent for the leaser and of the property and was interested in having him continue on the property, which he had decided to quit in September of that year. The sheriff came to the mill and served papers, and this is when everything went to hell in a handbasket. So, as I mentioned before, Wright did not really give a shit about what Marshall and Thurber were trying to do. He was in his own world. It is said that he was advised by certain friends to resign from the company, which he did, supposing that these friends would look after his interests. However, all they ever gave him and his wife was $1,200 out of a considerable fortune. One may wonder how somebody who is convicted to life imprisonment is able to secure a commutation from the governor of Michigan. Well, it's the same as it always has been. You have to have friends in high places. And according to an article from 1902, efforts to secure the pardon of Charles T. Wright, friends are working. The latest regarding the commuting the life sentence of Charles T. Wright is gleaned from the following telegram dated Detroit, Michigan, November 15th. Quote, the matter of commuting sentence, the sentence of Charles T. Wright, from life to 15 years, will be brought up again at the next meeting of the Pardon Board to be held in Ionia next week. It is believed by at least one member of the committee that it will be settled one way or the other. Judge F.H. Aldrich of Detroit, who heard the case and sentenced Wright to life, will be asked to appear before the board and give his opinion on the case's merits. Judge Aldrich was seen in his offices in the Moffett block and asked if he favored commuting Wright's sentence. He replied that he was neither for nor or against it and would remain neutral. He did not think that a judge who heard the case should be called upon to express an opinion in such an emergency. The judge outlined the case briefly as follows. Quote, Charles T. Wright was a man worth in the neighborhood of $100,000. He was imperious, dictatorial, and prone to litigation, and consequently, he had many enemies. Rubbed the right way, he was one of the best fellows and had a faithful wife who stuck right to him. He was tried in Benzonia in April 1890 for the murder of Dr. Frankie Thurber, a supervisor. He was defended by Frank W. Cook of Muskegon. The testimony was in effect that Mr. Thurber and Mr. Marshall, a deputy sheriff, went to Wright's mill to levy on some logs. Wright met them on the highway. He was carrying a repeating rifle and said to them, "Do not interfere with my men, or I will drop you." Shortly after that, a shot was heard. Marshall was killed. Dr. Thurber, who was a man who was more petite than Mr. Wright, grappled with Wright and fought for possession of the rifle. While clinched in a close embrace, Wright reached into his pocket and drew a revolver, shooting Thurber through the abdomen. Then placed the same weapon to his ear and shot him in the head, killing him. The case attracted great attention, and it took 2 weeks to secure a jury. So again, when you have friends in high places, you're allowed to get away with a lot of stuff. And if you want to look back on some of the issues that we have in our country or, throughout the history of our country, it's always people with glad handing and, the good old boys club and a lot of stuff that probably isn't very on the up and up, but it is what it is. And, for a relative of mine to be killed in such a horrific manner, and then to be let off because he was influenced by, what it was, money. It's always money. And, 10 years for cold-blooded murder. I don't feel like justice was served in this particular case. I really don't. I am kind of disappointed in the fact that they were able to get this guy out of jail. It's kind of disappointing, Well, I will say that at least in 1906, the Wright Lumber Company had disbanded, and basically he had gone off and disappeared into his little world. And what was once a thriving town is now deserted, except for the visitors who visit daily, mainly to see the lone pine at Errol. Now, again, thank you to Larry Wakefield for putting together this incredible 4-parter of the murder at the sawmill and the book that he wrote. You can still find his books online, and he is no longer with us, but I believe he is got family in northern Michigan, and I believe the author is one of those guys that, he passed away in 1997. So the same year that I would have graduated high school, he passed away. So again, he is a very interesting guy. He's written a number of books. Some of the titles are, he did a lot about ghost towns, which is great. Ghost Towns of Michigan, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3. He did Ernest Hemingway Fish Cheer, Traverse City Postcard History, The Mystery of the Missing Nun, as I mentioned. So, you can take a look at all these books. Again, go to Goodreads, go to Amazon, whatever, and check them out. He was a prolific writer for the northern Michigan area, and he was the inspiration for this 4-part series. And I wouldn't have been able to do the series without those articles that he had written. So thank you so much to Larry Wakefield and Larry Wakefield Estate for that information, and newspapers.com for being the great resource that they always are. And thank you guys for tuning in to this week's episode. I have been off the grid a bit for a while, and I am happy to say that I'm feeling pretty good. And a couple bouts of COVID and some deaths of people and other things that have happened in the last few months that can make for a cranky guy, or I don't know, not a motivated individual. Yeah, what I'm talking about. Anyway, we are all in this together, and that's all I can say about that. If you want to follow me on Blue Sky, you can do so. I believe if you just search for Bill Huffman, it will come up, and that is a great alternative to the cesspool that has become Twitter, which was once a great tool for this job and for podcasting, for news, for everything, until one little man decided to purchase it and to destroy our democracy with a bunch of Nazi memes, fighting videos, war videos, and all the other crap that now infiltrates my timeline. It's absolutely worthless. It's unbelievable what this individual did to such a product that, you didn't need to do it. You didn't. Hopefully, you sell it. I don't know. Anyway, that's all I got on that. Until next time, as always, stay healthy and be safe.
Is the pressure of your wedding day being perfect from sunrise to sunset weighing on your mind? Planning a wedding is stressful, but guess what? We are here to help. On the Bridechilla podcast, we celebrate love and help you plan your wedding day. We're all about keeping it real and having fun every step of the way. So whether you're just starting to plan or counting down the days, we're here to help you stay cool, calm, and collected. We have expert tips and amazing guests like wedding dress designer Haley Page. Let's get this party started and embrace your inner Bridechilla. Listen to Bridechilla wherever you get podcasts or visit us at thebridechilla.com.
How far would you go in your pursuit of the American dream? Would you put in the work?
911, what's your emergency?
Would you take a big risk?
What's the problem? What's the problem?
Would you cheat? Would you lie?
Were they shot? Were they shot?
Would you kill?
My mom is dead. My mom is right there.
I'm Jeremy Schwartz, and I'll be taking you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side to the American dream. You'll meet the picture-perfect brothers who teamed up to kill their parents, the thief who stole babies and ruined countless lives, the crypto king who siphoned off billions in the name of saving the world, and plenty more. From assassins to gangsters to killers and con artists, whatever the case, whoever the criminal, you don't know the full story until now. Go to AmericanCriminal.com or search for and follow American Criminal wherever you get your podcasts.